Understanding China has become more difficult than ever, yet also more important than ever. Hardening geopolitics has made travel to China more difficult, but not impossible. Join me, Scott Kennedy, for an on-the-ground look at China, for conversations with people shaping China and scholars exploring the country firsthand. What makes China tick? Where is the country going? How should the U.S. respond to the China challenge? We'll dive into all this and much more on this podcast. Welcome to China Field Notes. Hello, and welcome to this edition of China Field Notes. I'm Scott Kennedy, Trustee Chair in Chinese Business and Economics here at CSIS. I think some of you who have followed our work know that I first started going to China in 1988. But when did I really know I wanted to be a China hand? That occurred in August of 1991 when I arrived in Nanjing, China, to be a student at the Hopkins-Nanjing Center, which was started in 1986 as a joint venture between Johns Hopkins University and Nanjing University. The center has survived many twists and turns since. It survived June 4th. It survived the pandemic. It has survived the trade war. It was an amazing experience for me to learn about how Chinese scholars look at the world, how they operate, how Chinese people think about their daily lives and the rest of the world in the United States. I also did it right when I got married. And so my wife also got to experience what it was like to live in Nanjing. And actually, for most of that year, we lived apart. Imagine a first year of marriage like that. And we're still married to this day. 34 years later, not only is my marriage going strong, but so is the Hopkins-Nanjing Center. It has survived many twists and turns, as I mentioned. But the question is, today in 2025, how healthy is the center? And can it not only survive, but can it thrive? And what does this mean for other scholarly cooperation programs between the U.S. and China? I'm delighted that today we are joined by Adam Webb, who is the current co-director of the Hopkins-Nanjing Center, where he also serves as resident professor of political science. He's been a faculty member at the center since 2008 and previously taught at Princeton and Harvard and was a visiting scholar at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's the author of 4 books, most recently, The World's Constitution, Spheres of Liberty in the Future Global Order, which was published just this January. His undergraduate degree in social sciences from Harvard and a master's and PhD in politics from Princeton. So Adam, thank you so much for joining us on China Field Notes.
Thank you. Happy to talk today.
Let me begin the conversation with you about your own evolution, because you've written 4 books. You are a serious scholar, and you are also managing this program in Nanjing, in China. And Nanjing, for those of us who have been, we recognize it is a very large, cosmopolitan, thriving city. But for many, it's off the beaten path. What drew you to academic exchange and to the center in particular?
Well, I had a fairly international upbringing myself, growing up in England and Spain and the US. And so I've always had a kind of global horizon in that sense. I actually came to studying China not as a China specialist. I've done stuff in other parts of the world, including Latin America and the Middle East and so on. I first came to China in 1997 for the Princeton and Beijing summer language program. And I worked in various issues, partly on China, partly on other parts of the world. And then I came to HNC in 2008, first as a faculty member, thinking that I would stay for a couple of years. And then that turned into multi-year appointments. I was here some of the time, away some of the time doing field work. And then I became co-director in 2019, which was just in time for all of the fun of the pandemic. So I think part of what I bring to this role is that, unlike, I think, pretty much all previous co-directors, I'm not a China specialist in the usual sense. I'm obviously deeply interested in China, and I include China in the global issues that I'm dealing with, but I try and bring a more broader, more global perspective to what I do here at HNC. And I think that affects not only my intellectual work, but also how I approach the center's mission in this global context.
That's really important to know. And the center has had very good leadership, both in Nanjing and back in Washington and Baltimore over the years. And you're just crucial for the success of the center. Can you tell the audience who may not be as familiar with the Hopkins-Nanjing Center as you and me, what are the unique or distinctive characteristics of the center that make it attractive for students from China and from around the world to study there?
The saying that if you want to succeed in any task, one of the best things you can do is be born earlier than your rivals. And HNC was born earlier than other kinds of international campuses in China. We opened in 1986 as the first international partnership of this type. And I think there are several distinct things about it. One is that it is this equal 50-50 partnership between two parent universities. So we have Nanjing University with its deep roots in China. We have Johns Hopkins with its global reach, its three-campus network. And both of these partners are deeply involved in our academic programs and operations. Another feature, of course, is that this is a relatively small graduate student-only program. So we have a certificate program, we have an MA program, we have various pathways which go on to Washington or Bologna, but this is very small. We have fewer than 200 students here in total. It's all graduate level. And unlike pretty much all of the other international programs, this is a bilingual campus. So all students who come here are proficient in both English and Chinese. They can do graduate level coursework in both languages. So this really allows us to have not only the global perspective, but also to be able to dig deeply into Chinese political and social issues using both languages. One way that I like to think about us here is that we are fully part of both parent universities, and we really aim to be this kind of unique point of contact between English-speaking and Chinese-speaking academic and policy universes. So you do get something here that you wouldn't get at either an international campus where everything is taught in English, or at a Chinese university, which may lack some of those broader global perspectives and norms.
That's really helpful to know. When I first arrived at the center in 1991, one of the things that I noticed was I could walk straight into the library, any part of it, and find a book or a magazine, even many from the United States, which if I had gone out on the street in China then, I would not have found. So it had the open stacks and encouraged intellectual debate on a whole bunch of different types of topics. Are those still cornerstones of the center today?
Yes, academic freedom was written into our founding documents back in the 1980s, and it's been very clear that this is a non-negotiable condition for continuing to operate here. So despite all of the changing political and diplomatic context around us, that has not changed in how we operate, the range of topics that we discuss, both in the classroom, with visiting speakers, other kinds of events that we have here. I've been on the faculty here now for 17 years, and I've certainly never had any restrictions on what I can cover in the classroom. I cover all kinds of topics in my politics classes on authoritarianism, democratic transitions, social movements, a whole range of ideas that you would not see freely discussed in other contexts. And that is something that I think both parent universities and both governments recognize are indispensable principles for us operating here. And that allows us, given the subject matter that we have here with our academic programs dealing with international relations, politics, society, economics, that really is indispensable to be able to talk about those things seriously in China, but also on a global stage.
So you're in Nanjing, you're not in Beijing or Shanghai, Shenzhen, Hong Kong. Does that help with maintaining that kind of environment, or does that make it more of a challenge because maybe you're in a city that might be slightly more lean more conservatively, or not have the heft of a tier one city that can argue for these kind of things with ministries? Or what's the strengths and weaknesses of being in Nanjing for that, maintaining that kind of environment?
I think one of the considerations in setting up in Nanjing in 1986 was that by not being in Beijing, we would be somewhat out of the political center. So it may have given us a bit more political leeway, particularly as winds change back and forth in Beijing, to be able to operate without necessarily getting embroiled in national politics and those things, which is probably a risk of being in a capital city. At the same time, I think the sense was that Nanjing had more historical depth than Shanghai as a commercial city. So that was the original logic of this, and that has, I think, stood us in fairly good stead. Jiangsu province in general has a reputation for being perhaps maybe somewhat more cautious on some things. But again, we are operating in a very distinct enclave here with norms which are not the same as at Chinese universities. I think the geography of being here in Nanjing also is very different now than it would have been 20 or 40 years ago. The high-speed rail connections, one can get to Beijing in about 3.5 hours on the fast train now. So we're certainly not as isolated from the capital city as we would have been before. So we are distant enough in the right way, but also well enough connected to any part of China. And our students, when they're here, they do travel all over the country. They do field work in different areas as well.
Well, when I was there, speaking about the long ago era, it took about 4.5 hours to get from Nanjing to Shanghai by train. It was a little bit slower than it is today. And that's how long it takes to get from Beijing to Shanghai now. So
At Shanghai now, it's about 1 hour and 40 minutes, I think. And my next ticket to Shanghai, but you could even get there in 1 hour if you go from Nanjing South Station to, I think, Shanghai Hongqiao. So it's a lot shorter than it could be.
you theoretically could commute every day.
You could, yeah.
Yeah. I just did the New York to Washington, quote unquote, high speed Acela last night. It's still not quite in China's realm yet. Still a ways to go. Let me ask a little bit about the composition of students. It's a totally graduate student program. We have students from all over the world. Where do the students come from? How many are from the United States? What are their interests? And can you tell us a little bit about the Chinese students that are there?
Yeah, so we have about around 170 students, give or take. It fluctuates a bit from year to year. Somewhat over half of those are Chinese students. They come from all over China. Universities in the eastern part of China are probably overrepresented in that. It's a mix. I mean, Chinese students, if they're in the MA program, they have taken a very competitive entrance exam in addition to HNC's admissions processes. So it is a very competitive thing as a Chinese student to get into the MA program here. And you do see a real kind of academic quality in that sense. We also have Chinese students who come here for 1 year for the certificate program. Very often they're doing that as a kind of gap year as part of an MA degree that they're doing elsewhere, whether at Nanjing University or other Chinese universities. I would say our Chinese students in general have a much wider horizon than they did in the past. Many more of them have traveled abroad. They often have learned languages other than English as well. So it's a very different kind of Chinese student population than it would have been at the beginning. International students predominantly come from the United States, but we have students from all over the place, from Europe, other parts of East Asia. We've had students coming from Africa and Latin America as well. That's been picking up a bit in recent years. I would say the kinds of students who come here are coming from fairly broad range of disciplines in their previous studies. They all have an interest in these points of contact between China and the world. They also have a real curiosity about each other and the ability, particularly using both languages, to be able to engage in a deeper way than you would if you were just studying either as a Chinese student studying abroad or as an international student studying at an English-speaking campus only.
So I want to ask a little bit now about the pandemic. I know you arrived at the center first in 2008, but then took over as co-director in 2019. Very auspicious. Obviously couldn't predict what had happened right after that. But can you give us a flavor of what it was like to go through the pandemic in those, first few months, and then what the transition was like, how the center got through it, and the reopening of China? And what did that arc feel like for you?
I remember when I first heard about COVID, I'd seen something on an email list that I was on about something like SARS that was starting in Wuhan, and I actually phoned upstairs to one of my colleagues and said, it sounds as if there's something like SARS in Wuhan. And he just groaned on the phone, but we thought that was kind of passing news that wouldn't amount to anything. One of the ironies is that I was in Washington for meetings early in January of 2020, and I had an initial conversation about starting some online courses and so on, but this was framed in such general terms about something we might want to do a couple of years down the road, nothing to do with any pandemic or anything. And then 3 weeks later, suddenly we were pivoting online. I think we were actually the first institution probably in the world to start doing any kind of academic instruction online as a response to the pandemic. Some other institutions delayed opening or were trying to adjust in other ways. And then we pivoted online pretty quickly. And I think we remained online probably longer than anybody else as well, because we kept the online option until June of 2023. And in that time, initially, the center was completely closed with everything online. We created an option for students to create a kind of HNC and Exile cluster at the SAIS Europe campus in Bologna, Italy. We had about 20 students and a few of our international faculty, including myself, who joined that for either 1 or 2 semesters in the 2020 to 2021 academic year. Spring of 2021, we reopened the campus here for students who were in China and who wanted to have an on-campus, at least residential experience, even while taking classes online. I think about half of our Chinese students took up that option, and we had around 5 international students who were in China who hadn't left at that point. I came back for one semester myself in 2021 when we reopened that, but that was a very small community on campus, which I think meant something for people to be able to live here, but it was still predominantly a virtual academic program at that point. And then we created some other possibilities around the world. I actually led a trip to Peru in the spring of 2022 on China-Latin America relations. There was only 8 of us doing that, but we went up to this Chinese mining operation in the highlands and interviewed people who had been displaced by this village resettlement program. I think for some people on that trip, that was strangely a high point of the pandemic, to be able not only to get together in person, but also to do this in Peru and see a kind of microcosm of China's growing footprint around the world. SAIS also created an option for international students to spend time in Taiwan in 2022, 2023. So we pieced together a lot of these different in-person clusters around the world to complement the virtual offerings. But a lot of people remained virtual until graduation in June of 2023. And then that was the first normal graduation we'd had for 4 years at that point, and it really felt that things were coming back to normal at that stage finally. But it was a long time. It was 3.5 years in total, and China's borders seemed to be sealed indefinitely in 2021, 2022. There were, real questions about how long we could continue in that kind of mode with students scattered all over the world.
So, sitting in Washington and watching the conversation here about U.S.-China relations, national security, economic security are big topics here. You see that discussed in state governments, localities around the United States. There is a lot of skepticism about the value of people-to-people contacts in the relationship, about being on the ground in China, about whether you can really learn what's going on, about whether it's safe, about what that experience means, and the risks that may come with it. Could you, for skeptics, what's the best argument that the center is providing value, whether it's about research or about understanding people or other things? What's the core value of the center that skeptics really need to understand?
I think we saw some manifestation of this in 2023 and 2024 when people who had, in many cases, been shut out of China for 4 or more years started coming back here. And just from their own experience and the conversations I had with them, you had people who, had a lot of expertise on China, but not being here. And I think they had felt very disconnected from what was happening on the ground, and being able to have conversations with Chinese counterparts, being able to observe conditions here, being able to have all kinds of frank, informal conversations about political, social topics and so on with people. This really does give you something in person that you cannot get from a distance, particularly when people who are operating at a distance are often projecting certain ideas onto the other. And this cuts both ways. This is also within China, when it was largely cut off from the world and people were not really allowed to go abroad during the pandemic. There was also a kind of insularity and a lack of perspective on what was happening elsewhere around the world. So any avenue for people to speak to each other directly, and whatever their views, they may disagree strongly with each other, but at least being able to see things firsthand and have these kinds of conversations, I think, does really help comprehension and elevate the level of serious thinking about these important issues. For HNC specifically, this is a unique platform here, right? This is a platform for free and open academic exchange. We can talk about things here in frank ways that you really cannot do almost anywhere else in China or in a lot of international contexts involving China. So when people look at these kinds of institutions or partnerships and think they come out of an era of engagement which perhaps is deferring too much to Chinese sensibilities or Chinese official organs, I would say quite the contrary. I mean, this actually is a very vibrant and open space where you can talk about these kinds of things in a free way. And I think you would lose something very important if these kinds of spaces did not exist here. I think the other point I would emphasize is that whatever the political and diplomatic context around this, we have certain foundational principles, including academic freedom, that we defend against pressure from whatever direction that might come from. We do see our mission here as being long-term, and obviously we are operating in an environment where there are certain political and diplomatic winds blowing. But in terms of our mission, we believe that we should be trying to transcend those kinds of short-term disruptions.
So I've been to China a lot in the past few years, including a short trip to Nanjing about a year and a half ago, and really enjoyed visiting with students at the center and talking with folks and seeing Nanjing again. China's economy is slowed down quite a bit over the last 15 years and since the pandemic. And as many people who are following China know, the word of the year seems to be involution or nejuan. In talking about the ways in which the center is valuable and gives people particular insights, are the students or scholars doing research on China's economy, on these kinds of challenges? How are they getting out there into the field to understand China's economy and business?
Well, international economics is one of the fields that we cover here at the center. So we do have both Chinese and international faculty who work on different aspects of China's economy, trade, financial system, investment, and so on. I would say there is an awareness that if you look at the macroeconomic indicators, which may or may not be fully reflective of reality, there clearly has been, as you say, a slowdown. I would probably also say anecdotally, some of the economic pressures beneath the surface may be more than what some of the statistics reveal. I have noticed in restaurants, often the foot traffic seems to be somewhat less than it was, 2 or 3 years ago. So there is a different economic mood now than there was a few years ago. And certainly when I came here in 2008, this was the first Beijing Olympics, the sort of global financial crisis where the West seemed to be collapsing and the Chinese model seemed to be going from strength to strength. And I think the mood now is a lot more ambivalent about the future and about the policy environment. Just in terms of our own students and looking for jobs and the like, I think they are experiencing a much more competitive job market. And this applies both to Chinese and to international students. I think the era of international students coming here and reasonably expecting they're going to make a fortune in Shanghai with one of these kind of generous expat corporate arrangements, those days clearly have passed. There has been a lot more localization of talent. And you certainly can carve out a career where you have both familiarity with China, functional expertise, the ability to connect globally, and you can certainly do that, but it's a different landscape for foreigners working in China and pursuing careers here than it was 15 years ago. And for our Chinese students as well, I think they often do want to explore opportunities farther afield than they would have done. I've actually been struck by how many of our Chinese students are interested in options of working abroad, not only in the West, but in Southeast Asia and other places. And that, again, is something which is quite different from 10 or 15 years ago. So I think that China is definitely not in one of these eras of 7% growth ad infinitum. There probably is a long period of relatively slow or static growth while China works through a lot of these deeper questions about the economic and social and political model. But at the same time, of course, this is a large chunk of the world, and in one way or another will continue to remain important, and being able to understand multiple layers of what's happening in China is going to remain indispensable as we look into the coming decades.
Well, sitting where you are, I imagine you could take a variety of different attitudes and perspectives about where China is headed. You might be a uber optimist. You might be cautiously optimistic. You might be cautiously pessimistic. You might be fatalistic. And maybe that depends on the time of day and how much coffee you've had or how much beer you've had. And sitting talking to me and the audience right now, where do you fall on that spectrum? And, what are the things that really worry you about the future, but what things give you hope about where China is headed?
Well, this is a large and diverse society and economy. And depending on the place and the layer of Chinese society that one's talking about, one finds parts of it that are very well equipped for cutting edge global innovation, being competitive anywhere in the world. And you find other segments which are, in many ways, stagnant or backward or hampered by institutional arrangements and the like. So it's a very mixed bag. And I imagine that whatever's happening with the aggregate economic statistics with slower growth or stagnation, there will be some sectors or segments of China's population that continue to do quite well, particularly when they are adapting and connected to other kinds of global networks. And there'll be some which don't fare as well. So that you may be a greater differentiation rather than this narrative of a very fast rising tide lifting all boats, which has been the prevailing story over the last 30 or 40 years. I think also the policy environment here, particularly given the outsized role of the state in the economy, the policy environment here is a crucial factor in what direction this goes if we're looking not only over the next couple of years, but longer term, over the next decade or two. And I think there is a growing sense in China that a lot of the economic and political model does have fundamental questions to address. And it's often when pressures build up and the performance slows with the previous model, that in a way it forces a reckoning, or it forces these kinds of deeper conversations about what the model should be and whom it's delivering for. So I certainly don't think that China 10, 20 years down the road is going to look the same as it is now. I don't think it's going to turn into Luxembourg or Singapore 15 years down the road. It's probably not going to grow anywhere near as fast as it has been. But again, the model and whom it's delivering for, I think, will be a subject of increasingly intense conversations.
Yeah, when I was in China over the summer, I also heard a lot of people talk about anxieties they had about the economy, as well as China's place in the world and US-China relations. Actually got to spend some time with two of my Hopkins-Nanjing Center Chinese classmates this summer in Shenzhen, where they live and have worked for quite some time. Which brings me to one of our final topics, which is about the US-China relationship, which is, broadly speaking, over the last 9 to 10 years, become more tense, where we've gone from primarily emphasizing cooperation to having some areas of contention to reversing those to where it's primarily a competitive relationship, but we still have lots of areas where we collaborate, including in scholarly exchange and business and other things. But, if you hear the conversation in the United States, and actually when I go to China and talk to officials and others, there's deep worries that both sides have about each other. Lots of skepticism about their motives, about trust. So you sit at the center of the relationship with a lot of American and Chinese young people who live with each other, interact with each other on a daily basis. At the ground level, at the people-to-people level, what does the U.S.-China relationship feel like? Does it feel like what we read in the New York Times, or is it different when you're on the ground in the center?
I think on a micro level here in the interactions between people, you don't really see any of these kinds of diplomatic tensions manifesting. And people have a range of views about the relationship between the countries, but I think people tend to be quite open and friendly in how they engage with one another. I think our class discussions don't see people polarized in the ways that an outsider might expect. So in that sense, HNC really does deliver what it intends to deliver, which is this kind of open platform for people to encounter one another. And just because of common interests and friendships and living together and so on, I think you come to understand that on both sides, you're ultimately dealing with people in all of their humanity and diversity. So in that sense, it's, I think, heartening to see people interacting this way here in our own small community. As far as the broader context, there's no inherent reason why China and the US need to be at odds with one another. This is certainly one of the most fraught periods in US-China relations. I think all of the other instances during the history of HNC have been short-term blow-ups, whether it's about Tiananmen Square or the Belgrade embassy bombing or other kinds of situations which then died down quietly. Certainly the last several years have been the most prolonged time of friction between the two countries. But I'd say if you look at what's driving this on both sides, one blunt way of putting it is that each country has a lot of its own demons that it's working through. And sometimes when you have these kinds of fevers building up and lashing out at one another, this is often reflecting what's happening in turn. In the case of China, regime type does matter. Foreign policy is very much shaped by the internal arrangements within a country. There are, I would argue, different versions of Chineseness, different images of what China's encounter with the world and integration with the world look like. And some of the harder-edged aspects of Chinese foreign policy are not hardwired into 1.4 billion people. That's something that could evolve in the future. And conversely, in the case of the United States, there is this kind of thrashing about as America works through its own evolving national identity and internal fault lines around everything from migration, diversity, economic restructuring. America's place in the world, inevitably, if you look at the economic and demographic factors, America's footprint is, over the long term, shrinking. And I think American national identity is adjusting to that and often sees China's growing influence over the last few decades as a kind of manifestation or a symbol of that. But China is not the only part of the world that is gaining in ground. I mean, I would imagine that other parts of the global south will be growing much faster than China in the coming decades, and the landscape will continue to shift in other ways as well. And one thing that I sometimes like to ask students in my classes here when we talk about globalization is, can you imagine an American national identity in which being number one in the world is somehow not essential to it? And conversely, can you imagine a modern Chinese national identity in which becoming number one is not essential to it? I mean, these are both fundamental questions in how these two countries and societies are viewing each other, which I think still have quite a long way to work through. The other observation I would make about this is, important though this bilateral relationship is and has been as one of the sort of key topics that we cover here at HNC, it is a big world out there. And part of the reason we have broadened the coverage of topics that we do at HNC to global issues is because most of the world is not China and not America. And the rest of the world probably is growing in importance relative to both. So this global context in which the relationship itself is nested, I think, will come to matter greatly as well.
It's certainly a sign of provincialism to just talk about U.S.-China relations. And I get that. And I live in a town which is supposed to be global, but has a lot of provincial elements to it. I would say, just to reinforce the point that you made, when I was a student at the Hopkins-Nanjing Center several decades ago, I think most of the American students and myself went there with a sense of what America's role in the world was. And it was the Chinese students and the faculty and the people that we met, which were struggling to figure out what China's role was going to be. And here we are 34 years later, and things have flipped. Americans are struggling to figure out what their role in the world would be and how you define America. And it's the Chinese who seem to have a much clearer idea about the direction that they're headed in. Although I do think that there's probably some interesting debates within China about that direction, and maybe you have those debates amongst the students and faculty at the center. The U.S. feels particularly unsettled in a way that it didn't several decades ago. And I think that that creates maybe some challenges, but maybe some opportunities for what the kind of conversations and research are like. And I would also agree that beyond these two countries, the 198 others that exist have a big stake and a voice in where the world is going, and that it's a complicated place. And so trying to come to terms with all of that is why we need places like the center. I want to thank you for joining me on China Field Notes and talking with everybody about the experience. I've learned a lot today. I've learned a lot from my time at the center and since because of it. And I want to just thank you for sharing your perspectives with all of us.
Thank you very much. And I'd certainly also say to your listeners who have an interest in China and perhaps have not been here for some years, you're certainly very welcome to come and visit us or to visit other parts of China and see for yourselves how the situation on the ground is at the moment, warts and all, right? I mean, I'm certainly not sugarcoating aspects of what go on here, but I think it is something one benefits from seeing firsthand and talking to people and understanding deeply in a way that you can't do from a distance.
Very good advice. And I hope people take you up on the invitation. Again, thanks so much, Adam.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to China Field Notes. Stay up to date with our latest releases by following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to great content. Until next time.